What we need are more eyes. It had been a long time since Osmond had seen the grounds of Byrgenwerth. He thought, while walking through the sand-strewn and decrepit halls of ailing Loren, that standing before a new class of students would terrify him more than what the labyrinth could. He would, in fact, frequently worry about what everyone would think of him. Would he be laughed at? Surely he was by now more of an expert with the pole scythe than his old scholarly fields. Surely he would be regarded more as a teacher of combat than of astrology. What would drive him to the brink of madness was the question: did he regret this, or was he indifferent to it? The thoughts quickly ran off him, however, and he felt foolish for pondering such trivial things. In the labyrinth, time stood still. At least, it felt like that. Like he could search its depths to his heart's content, and only now and then re-emerge into a new world that had changed far beyond him. Each time he did so, he was made to wonder how many more times he had left in him. But if time stood still in the labyrinth, was he not then able to search it forever? Like how the Pthumerians themselves had never truly perished after all this time. Doris walked ahead of him and stood by the side of a black entryway, leading deeper into the Loren depths. Osmond stood opposite him on the other side while he peeked inside and threw in his torch. It landed in the center of a dark swallowed room, which the torchlight was not fully capable of illuminating. A quick shuffling could be heard moving away from the light behind the side which Osmond stood on. Doris laid his arm on the handle on his back, and Osmond fully retrieved his own pole scythe, nodding to his peer as he did so. Then he lunged around the corner, folding out the crescent blade at the tip of the long hilt, and swiped low where he heard the noise. A creature with a cloth covering most of its visage jumped in the air to dodge the swipe, and as it landed to brandish its claws at him, he had already spun around along with a swing into an overhead slam that he brought down into the fiend's head. It crumpled into the floor, making him believe he had cleaved straight through its body. Behind him, Doris had run straight ahead and began to strike with his own folded blade, both hands on the handle and attacking like it was a large axe at two similarly garbed creatures that snarled at his approach. The ordeal was made quick once Osmond assisted him with his longer reach, and soon Doris was picking up his torch from the ground, and they continued inside the room, up a stairwell running in its center to an elevated floor under the same ceiling. Loren was indeed vast, very much endless like its former Pthumerian kindred. But the fact that its inhabitants were solely that of blood-hungry beasts concerned him. He knew of the scourge victims cropping up over Yharnam and had on more occasions than one compared the two places with each other. If there indeed was a link, he did not know, but knew enough about the similarity to noticeably cause his mind to shudder. The horror he saw had come to Lauren once upon a time must indeed have been terrible. But it was over. Was it more insane to return into a world above that perhaps was doomed to suffer similarly and be one of its witnesses? Or perhaps to continue to delve among the ruins in which said horror only remained as footprints? He thought much in the labyrinth, which in itself he thought inane. But it was not fully under his control, where his mind wandered. They came into a large corridor, where the height could not be determined from the insufficient torchlight, nor could they predict the full length of it, and what manner of creatures were present. Doris, in his tattered hooded robe, walked ahead of him. The walls ended, and a wide space spread out in darkness before them. They could only see the stone floor as lit up by their light, but nothing else. The grand empty space in front of them seemed to emit a sound simply due to how far it must have stretched. The two of them stood with their heads tilted backwards, mouths slightly open as they stared into the void. Doris walked to the right slowly to illuminate the wall behind them, which revealed the end of the laid bricks and the beginning of naturally formed cave walls. He then walked further into the room. So too did Osmond. Two separate light sources with orbs of orange light around them that did not touch each other. Lauren was usually the host of several sounds, commonly wind and blowing sand, naturally accompanied by a distant, ferocious announcement of a bestial resident. But now they had gone, ceased, and left only a very audible silence behind. The eminence of such quiet was more potent, so even their own footsteps and flickering torches did not produce enough of a presence. Individual mounds then came into the light of both of their spheres of orange emittance. They were part of a row of mounds, placed evenly and stretched on far beyond their visibility. Immediately, upon inspecting the mounds, revealed themselves to be hunched, prostrating bodies with their foreheads to the stone floor, knees bent so they rested below the stomach, and with forearms stretching in front, elbows parallel with the head. Shortly in front began the next line, and further beyond that, a third one. Noticeably, each form was not a copy of the next. Undoubtedly, each were humanoid, but retained slight deformities. All, however, shared in the fact that they were, by all estimation, quite dead.
Corpses,
Doris mumbled while he began stepping ahead in between them.
Corpse after corpse after corpse after corpse after corpse.
His sound persisted as he went on ahead, but the exact wordings became more indistinguishable with the distance. Further in, after the 10th row, the bodies noticeably had begun to shift. While all had so far been humanoids, with some peculiarities of fur patches, elongated limbs, irregular sized limbs, or otherwise strange physiology, it had been slight. Now it was like the bodies were growing right before them as they walked. Arms that previously seemed only slightly longer than the other were now considerably larger and with claws covering them. Necks could stretch much farther than normal and possess a freakish bestial head. Nor did they seem to be consistent with the position, as some lay on their back outstretched, or even on top of each other. The difference being that those that broke the pattern all were left with macabre expressions of great horror and pain as their bodies were frozen in agonizing writhing. Clutching at their malformed arms, fingers clawing at their bestial head, or arms tightly wrapped around another balled up kindred deformity. By the 23rd row, they were barely humanoids, but more true to the aforementioned description of mounds. Their backbone was horribly arched, and their limbs inconsistent with their length, each of them a different beast it seemed. By that point the rows had relinquished their shape and started to curve more and more, honing in towards a center. When they happened upon a wall, there were only 4 incredibly horrid monsters slumped in an arc around a grand gateway. Each of them a good 17 feet tall in their slumped position. They wasted no time in entering through the ominous gate, deprived of light. It was narrow so as not to completely allow for 2 to walk side by side. The dark seemed to be less persistent up ahead and grew into a light source. Nearing its end, it seemed to be a place fully illuminated, and they emerged into a rectangular hall that stretched out before them. 2 rows of pillars ran along on each side, which possessed lit torches that provided visibility in the hall. They walked down a broad stone stair that covered the entire end wall. On the side walls were elevated platforms with figures irregularly positioned, sitting with their legs crossed and in a similar state as the carcasses from earlier. At the far end of the room lay something truly grand, black and hairy. Before it was yet another familiar slumped figure, sitting more upright with a white cloth that covered its back frame. Stepping in further, it arose, picking up a staff that was slightly longer than its own body and a flame lit up at its forked tip. Its neck began to stretch, and the cloth fell off as it turned back to look at them. Terrible, curved horns donned the head like a warped crown, and the neck was incredibly long and covered with long black hair that fell before the face and down onto the robed shoulders. The mantle fell off and the creature fully turned their way, bearing a gilded patterned white robe that could not hide the ferociously bestial body with long canine legs and twitching claws. It cawed out with the vocals of a verbal crow.
Santa Madre Maledictus Ebris.
It reached out with its arms that stretched to an impossible length from the body.
Benedice nobis, benedicat mihi, quia eo te efficam ne cubico dominae me.
It held the cruel staff towards them and began to advance stumblingly on its deformed legs. The two of them managed only a few determined steps before the regal beast swept from side to side with the staff that produced a wave of fire that torrented towards them. In a leap, it emerged from behind the wall of fire and slammed down with the staff at them. The movement seemed to fully reveal the true extent of the beast's size, as its arms and legs were incredibly long and the chest bulbous and heaving. It swung about the staff that trailed with a blazing trace in the air as it passed by them, and despite being the foulest of them all, it moved with an almost graceful posture. Osmond parried away the staff and quickly folded out the blade to try and stab at the thing, but it lunged onto its arms and crawled quickly backwards. Doris came running around it, and too folded out the crescent blade to swipe at the slender limbs. It made an acrobatic maneuver where it swiped with the staff and transitioned into a vaulting leap far away from them. When it landed, it started to heave and hulk like it was to pass its stomach. It brought the staff to its mouth and with a sickening sound seemed to almost draw out a bright liquid with the tip that it threw towards them. A liquid that burned brightly blue, but once landing, formed puddles and trails that burned like a normal fire. After which it let out a cawing cackle and began to swing the staff around in the air, spilling more of the liquid from it as it did, seemingly conjuring the mysterious flammable substance from the air. Osmond ran up to it, nimbly sprinting in between the flaming puddles, ducked a side swipe from the staff, and threw up the pole scythe in a cutting arc in front of him that impacted with the beast's arm. A horrible but surprised sound in the same crow fashion slipped from it, and it clumsily stepped backwards. Doris came running from the other side where the beast crudely began to slam down repeatedly with its balled fist. He swiped at the arm with a folded weapon, and once more it retreated further back, almost up against the wall. It began to cough and hurled up more of the blue liquid, burning as it passed from its throat, and it groaned frighteningly through the ordeal. While it did, both Osmond and Doris landed a few blows that it did not seem to pay much mind to. With the staff end plunged into the flaming puddle, it spun around, dragging it along the floor so sprays of blue, watery flame were sent from all around it. Both Doris and Osmond were thrown away by this, but seemingly both only sustained shallow wounds, as they were mostly hit by blunt force. Doris' robe did, however, catch on fire, and he threw it off, now donned only in the reinforced scholar's attire. The horned fiend leapt up on the stages behind it, and from it emitted another gurgling upheave that resulted in a loud spewing of the flame as it walked along the platform, like a flame-spouting dragon sending flames their way, crushing and toppling the figures as it did so. They took cover behind the pillars as the cascade passed over and around them. The monstrosity crashed through the pillar right next to Osmond, now with a considerably larger and bulbous chest, to the degree the ribcage seemed near to explode. Its eyes were enlarged and unfocused by madness in their sockets, as it heaved smoke from its maw. Osmond ducked behind the pillar while Doris came charging past, straight at it with the tip of the crescent blade extended like a lance. While the monster sluggishly evaded him and made a broad sweep with its free arm, Doris managed to hack into its side. It was only then that it struck Osmond that, although it had always been double their own size, it must have for some arcane reason grown larger. Seeing Doris right next to it certainly highlighted the change. It groaned and blood spewed from its wounds. It then threw the staff towards Osmond and fell onto its arms and crawled away, back to the end of the room, before the black mound with insectoid speed and manners. It did not cease its guttural sound, despite stopping right before it. Head turned towards them, eyes now glowing like embers. It began to glow while uttering eldritch words of primordial tongue, like a horrid incantation. The light grew blindingly, and upon finishing the last uttering, it simply screamed out and bright glow erupted in an enormous explosion that destroyed the 4 nearby pillars and sent Osmond and Doris tumbling backwards. In the wake of the explosion it stood, chest pressed forward, arms straightened and plunged into the ground, head tilted backwards in a ferocious scream. Once it tilted back to them, the horns must have grown longer and more numerous, for they now encompassed the entire face, save for the perpetually gaping maw, where its fangs were as great as the horns themselves. Its size even larger than before. Once again it erupted in an inhuman roar, and from within its mouth came a bright light, followed by a torrent of pure fire that encompassed the entirety of the middle area of the room. Osmond and Doris both jumped away in different directions, and while he lost track of Doris, he started running along the wall towards the beast. His sanity truly began to dwindle when first the color of fire changed into a stark blue. Then the nature of fiery energy transitioned into a controlled beam of light that spewed from its mouth. It turned its head, and with it, the beam followed, utterly demolishing the pillars in its path and leaving a trail of smoldering rubble in the wall and on the floor as it passed over. First, it passed over where Doris presumably was. Then it turned over onto Osmond's side, so he had to throw himself to the floor in order to fully evade the incredibly hot and forceful power that now was wielded by their foe. It alone turned the entire lighting of the room from an orange into a cold blue. The light subsided and the chamber returned to its former hue, the beast heaving while the mouth still smoldered from the flames. Osmond threw himself to his feet, folded in the blade and dashed the last distance, and before the beast had seemingly regained its bearings, he had managed to swipe at a horribly malformed right arm. The scream it let out was not too dissimilar from how a human would utter, but the tone was that of another being entirely, raven and guttural. It swiped backwards at him, then slamming with its palm down where he had once stood. Osmond moved around to its back, folding out the blade and plunged it into the side while trying to run further back to open up a larger cut. It jumped away and slowly prowled towards him, having landed further into the center. Its maw was unmoving, and the amount of curved fangs seemed to be positioned in such a manner the jaw was prohibited from fully closing itself. Above it sat no longer eyes, only horns, creating a twisting pattern with no visibility of the features beneath. Doris came running, as seen through the space between the arms and legs, and first sliced horizontally at them, then pierced the halberd weapon upward into its side, so blood came pouring down upon him. It flinched and looked back, hurling up another cascade of fire towards its assailant. Osmond ran to the right, to the opposite side of Doris, where he hacked with the folded blade at the legs. It gurgled and heaved terribly, with the undertone of furious anger. Then it sat upright on bent legs and dragged its claws along the ground on both sides of it repeatedly. One such swipe managed to sweep Osmond off his feet and throw him backwards. It quickly turned around and lunged upon him, and once again tore its claws along the ground, tearing over his left leg. He managed to crawl frantically backwards. The glowing maw increased its luminosity, and the roaring fire from within heralded itself with an increasing rumble. Doris ducked right under its elongated neck and pierced upward with a folded out blade so blood poured down. Then he had to swiftly move out of the way as the bluish, fiery liquid came spilling out from the wound. The creature staggered back with a surprised growl, clutching with both hands over the deep gash in its long throat. It began to growl so loudly and mighty that its entire head shuddered and with disregard to the spilling inner liquid, it began to slam with balled fists into the puddle already produced. This ignited furious blue flames that were sent flying like embers around its vicinity. Osmond managed to scramble onto his feet with poor balance, only being able to stand by the support of the long hilt of the pole scythe. He saw that his leg was indeed there, but with no pain present within it, it might as well have been absent. The clerical aberration swiped its claws backwards, sending a grand cascade of fire in an arc behind it as it threw itself forward where Doris stood. It appeared as if his partner simply vanished in the massive form that had thrown itself against him, crashing against the pillar. While it lay among the rubble, Osmond made a stumbling leap, largely made possible by the weight of the pole scythe, and cleaved into the beast's outstretched neck. Its body made a quick jolt before Doris emerged on the other side, in between the myriad horns and the outstretched left arm of the beast. With a scream, he lunged up and plunged the curved blade into the back of its neck. Osmond arced his blade back and brought it down like an axe, which made him lose his balance and collide with its back. With one hand supporting himself against its form, he folded in the blade and simply cut again at the back of the neck. Doris was equally engaged. But the beast had long since grown still, and what only echoed in the hall was the wet slashing within flesh and blood pouring from metal impacting again and again with the carcass. He lost his sight for a moment and felt himself tumble down along its side, coming to rest against it. He breathed heavily and thought to see that blue fiery light all around him, flickering in and out of the darkness of the room. He closed his eyes, but could not wholly shut the sight out, forcing him to bring his bloody hands to his eyes with the hope of reprieve. He heard sounds as well, a babbling ramble of that ancient tongue spoken by the old tender of the labyrinth, speaking unto him and repeating the same incomprehensible line delivered upon them at their entry. As he wished it all to end and to be left alone, his wish was granted. He opened his eyes and quiveringly removed his hands from his face. The lights were gone, and the only sound he heard could only be the irregular footfalls of Doris. He stared straight ahead and was left with an empty presence and a yearning that he could not place.
Come here.
He heard Doris' low voice speaking to him from the end of the hall. He could not determine if he heeded his beckoning right away or remained seated for hours, glaring ahead and left only with that horrifying yearning. Eventually he found himself limping towards Doris' hunched form. Before him lay an incredible mound of bone and fur, laying on its side with its neck stretched far and jaw agape. It must have been a great and terrible fiend in its days. But while its neck, arms, bones and chest was that of something foreign only to be described as akin to a vulpine monstrosity in its structure. The head was uncannily human. In comparison to the rest of the skeleton, the skull was rather small, but still double the size of his own. Doris reached forward and pawed at the thing lying within the chest cavity. An infant, which in opposition to its matronly host was that of a dried human corpse. No traits of beasthood visible, only the frame of a fairly large, mummified man, as it would appear. To Osmond, the sight did not strike him the slightest, but Doris seemed enthusiastic about the find, and he reached for the 3 tentacle growths emerging from its stomach and ended laying flat on the stone floor. One of them he jerked away, the smallest of the 3, and held it in his hand for a moment.
Now, we return.
Stanton, clad in a protective robe and apron, paired with a mouthguard and slick form-fitting gloves, cast a secondary, investigative glance around the exterior of the main building before entering and shutting the door. Well inside, he went to the storages and picked a cylindrical glass container, a lid, and a stick of wax. He strapped the standard surgical equipment to his belt and approached the tightly closed wooden hatch close to the main floor's desk. He put down his heavy equipment and plucked out a key that hung around his neck. He unlocked a little mechanism that kept it shut and then went over to a tiny crank attached to a chain. He turned it, and the hatch lifted itself by the tensioning of the chain. Upon release, it remained fixed to keep the latch open, and he looked over the edge into the darkness. Directly next to the ladder leading down hung a lantern. He took hold of it and rapidly lit it up. With all the inventory strapped to his person, he cumbersomely knelt down and precariously descended down into the darkness, where only the lantern light gave sight.
Hello, Stanton here.
His casual announcement went on deaf ears, as not a sound was given back from the dark halls. He knew that there would never be an answer to his calls, but tended to perform the gesture anyways. He entered into a large subterranean chamber, originally the first excavation site, built to push back the lake and expose the mysteries beneath. He landed on a wooden platform and continued down a stairwell onto the dirt floor. There were thick stone pillars for support, but were not visible in the lantern light. He walked cautiously for his own sake. Despite having carried out the task several times prior, his muscles would always tense and heart beat faster. He continued straight ahead and stopped in between two pillars, listening. He thought to hear a sound towards the right, and he walked towards the dirt wall, reinforced by wooden planks. He entered a narrow corridor where the ceiling was not visible. It led to a series of smaller corridors, crossing one another. There he heard the sound that so eerily marked the reason for his presence. A slurping sound, accompanied with bare feet tapping against the hard, trampled dirt. Very faint, as if a human perpetually walked around with a bowl to their face and regularly breathed in the liquids from it, but through incredibly fat lips. He walked into the next corridor, yet to be enlightened by the yellow glow. The naked footsteps continued to wander around, and they grew louder with him reaching closer. Soon, the light touched upon a white, tattered garb emerging in the pitch darkness. As soon as it did, as if burned by it, it ran deeper into the depths. "Sorry," he muttered low enough for only him to hear. He walked towards the figure who had just stopped a few steps ahead. The light approached once more, and it again illuminated the torn and dirty garb. Now too was the insectoid growth visible. Limbs, growing like wings, having torn themselves through the cloth and out on its back. The slurping grew louder as he grew closer. The figure turned and looked upon him with its hideous head. "Sorry for startling you, Ava," he muttered, but articulated each word with care. The head was oversized for the body, and was formed in an asymmetrical sphere. Wing-like growths sprouted from the back of the head, which was otherwise covered with eyes. It stood still and twitched occasionally, lurched forward with its nasty fingers, constantly appearing as if reaching for something. He grabbed a small vial from his tool belt and held it up. It was hard to say if any of the myriad eyes looked at it even once, as they darted around in their foul sockets. He opened the lid and held it far away from himself, while bringing it under the malformed head, to where the mouth may have been. Small tendrils twitched at the odor of the vial. Nothing changed in the figure's mannerisms. It continuously stood in place. "Okay. This will only take a moment." He placed down his larger inventory and picked out a piece of cloth and his pincher. He stood close to the enlarged head and laid the cloth under one of the more bulbous eyes. The figure continued to stand still. He grabbed hold of the skin around the socket, and with a small scoop, he gently started to loosen the eye where it sat. It came out very easily, a ripe one. He took it and dexterously laid it into the empty glass container. In the absence of the eye, the socket's fleshy hole that remained started to morph itself together, and soon there was no hole. He removed the cloth, slightly stained with a light grey liquid, and laid it under another, equally bulbous eye. Each of the ones he plucked was as large as his balled fist, while others were smaller. One could practically pluck them as peaches with their hands, although using proper instruments ensured its quality. The process was repeated until about 6 eyes had been removed from the creature's head. Still there remained countless of them. He gently gave it a brief pat on the head in a space absent of eyes, before readying his tools in search for the next harvest. When he emerged from the basement, Hockney stood alone in the main hall, a man of similar stature and appearance to himself in many ways, and helped him by grabbing the jars as he came up.
How are they faring?
Well enough. He was given an apologetic glance that was reinforced with him shaking his head slightly.
It could not be helped, you know?
Yeah, you keep saying that.
Yes, well, I came to tell you Osman and Doris have returned.
His head turned quickly towards him, and his eyes widened.
Truly? And Master Valar?
Not yet. Oh. Well then, are they? Hockney rubbed his shin and contorted his mouth as he delayed responding.
You know, they don't really say much. It's more what they brought back that is of interest.
I can imagine, but I would nonetheless want a word with them, after all this time. He bobbed his head from side to side and crumpled the space between his brows.
What I mean is, they really don't say much that makes sense.
Stanton felt a lump form in his throat, but he promptly swallowed it. What was important was that the two had returned alive, and were now safe within Bergenworth for the time being.
Let's go then.
He removed the apron and tool belt and clumsily tossed them onto the nearby hook, intending to return for them later.
Certainly, but...
He was already out the door and could not hear if Hockney had finished the sentence. But he was not far behind him on their way over the grounds to the lecture building. He saw them sitting down at the very end of the central hall outside the cellar door. Before them stood 2 senior scholars. Another was hunched beside them, with his back turned to Stanton as he approached. His footsteps echoed so loudly in the largely empty hall that he was on the cusp of feeling embarrassed for the noise. Osmond's robe, upon closer view, was covered in somewhat dry blood at its end, and he was missing the right arm guard. He sat hunched with elbows resting on his knees, while the fellow with his back turned was seeing to an incredible, half-bandaged, open wound in the side of his left leg, seemingly having only just made the bleeding stop and was now in the process of cleaning the gash. The old master sat with a blank stare right in front of him, jaws slightly hanging open, and with no apparent acknowledgement of the ongoing treatment. Beside him sat Doris, similarly hunched, but was occasionally rubbing his entire face with both his hands. Then he would cease to simply slouch with his head low and hold his hands over his ears, then resume to rub his face. Unlike Osmond, he was lacking his robe and the chest guard had been removed, leaving an outline of where it had once been over his shirt, since the rest of him was covered in a consistent black soot.
Master? You returned?
He commented absent-mindedly, for he had admittedly not managed to conjure up a more appropriate greeting. Osmond looked his way, briefly, then back into the wall ahead.
Där, Dominos. Yes, quite.
Stanton was given a look from the two seniors, a look somewhat conveying sympathy.
Pardon, Master Osmond?
He smirked.
Yes, like a snake it was. A little vermis. Yes, the Dominus, that is.
One of the two seniors leaned in closer to Stanton, but did not put much effort in speaking outside of Osmond's earshot.
He is speaking partially in the old Sumerian writing, but crudely so.
Why? Why ever? The previous look of sympathy became something else upon him, raising one eyebrow higher than the other.
He has reached his limits, boy. What a shame. So many years with the institution. And almost to celebrate his 140th year. What a shame.
But that's how the cookie crumbles. The other of the two added and chuckled.
Not able to stop himself once he saw it. Truly a shame that he is rendered unable to tell us comprehensively.
Stanton was forced to accept, quite maddeningly, that his two masters had long ago given him their last teachings, and that he was simply left with what he had received in that time. Such a thing was terribly discouraging to ponder, for it had always seemed that they were uncovering the truth, bit by bit, together. I suppose they want to return soon?
Is that all, Stanton?
Doris pricked up and froze in his movement, hands still held over his face. From behind them he saw an eye peer back widely at him, reflecting the light of the chandelier. He reached into his pocket, where he retrieved a folded handkerchief, wet and stained with something dark. He reached it towards Stanton, and everyone, even the doctor, was glaring and following along the movement of the little object being passed.
Go on, take it. You ought to discover it too.
Stanton cupped his hands, and a piece of cloth was dropped into them, feeling cold and damp. Doris then stood with his hands still shielding his face and left for the exit of the lecture building. Bewildered, Hockney followed after him. Stanton carefully unraveled the cloth and found a very confusing sight of a black worm, still damp and having colored the cloth in black stains. Although looking like a worm, it did not move, but judging from its moisture, did in fact appear much like a live worm. It was largely dark grey, with wrinkled, fleshy texture and dark, completely black, glossy spots all over it, in lines on its form. They looked very much like eyes.
Careful there, boy.
He looked up and saw the trembling expression of the two seniors. Eyes wide as if struck with the deepest terror and making shallow, rapid breaths.
Hold it firm. We must go see Master Willem this instant.
Willem was wheeled through the central hall of the lecture building. Well from down the hall he could hear up ahead the rumble, shuffling and mumbling voices of his peers in the gathering chamber. With the precision that the attendants quieted down upon the door being opened, and he saw all their eyes aimed at him, he was led to believe he had suddenly awoken from a dream. About 25 individuals occupied the rows in the large lecture room, and each one followed him eerily by turning their heads as he was wheeled up to the front, where the desk usually stood. Instead, there was a smaller table with surgical instruments and various necessities for such an operation. Beside it stood two men with face masks and brown aprons over their usual attire, in addition to bearing long gloves. He was placed facing the rows of seats, with everyone still aiming their attention his way. He did not meet the gaze of any of them, but looked ahead, out the window where the dark of night presided. He had not the ability to afford himself to stand before them, resorting to addressing them from his chair.
We are... together we have struggled. Now, just see to it, will you?
Aggravatingly, the words escaped him, and he resorted to waving to the two men off to the side to begin. They rolled the table of surgical tools closer to stand right by his chair's side. In it, he was completely supported by the tall backrest, furthered by one of them tugging at a latch that leaned it backwards, so his face was instead aimed closer towards the ceiling. while not entirely being in a lying position. A metallic canister was brought to his face, and a silvery cloudy gas was released that momentarily obscured all sight. He breathed deeply and felt his senses numbing, growing to such depths that reality seemed more like a dream. The only thing that kept the illusion from fully dominating his impressions was the fact that the effect was anticipated. His head adornment was removed, and he stared freely up into the ceiling. A leather band was fastened around his forehead, a metal frame within it that tightened firmly, although he did not feel much of it, more so than being aware of its presence. He felt like he had long ago fallen asleep, yet he stared with wide, waking eyes straight up. His body soon started to feel alien to him, like he was a butterfly trapped in a cocoon that was his mortal form. The drill into his skull was acknowledged by his vision shaking slightly. His teeth clattered together once it fully started to pierce the bone, but he did not feel able to open his jaw to prevent it. There was an adjustment to the frame around his head before a second drilling began. When the string was being pulled through by the curved needle, it was like someone planted a thought into his head. At least he liked to believe it was like that, since he could acknowledge that something that was not of his own making was moving around in there. It admittedly unnerved him. When the cord entered, it felt even stranger, even more akin to an idea. One of the doctors made a surprised sound, followed by the second one gasping. To Willem's horror, he felt how the cord started to writhe. It convulsed and vibrated, creating a growing sound in his ears attuned to the movement. A sort of whistling, or perhaps the echo of a bell's resonance. Instinctively he wanted to sit up, to throw his hands to the back of his head, and for all his life remove whatever was crawling inside of his head. But he was unable to. Not wholly because of the sensation keeping his body animate, but the addictive allure that the overwhelming, all-encompassing presence of eyes created. Along with the sound ringing in his ears, he started to see more of the room, like he was being carried along as the sound traveled out from him. The string now crawling inside his brain grew and expanded. So did the sound. If he was screaming, if the others were screaming, he could not hear. But he saw in a completely new way, like he was looking into the reflection of an eye that beheld the entire room. He saw it all. The faces of the attendants looking around, trying to locate a sound that evidently was all around them. The doctors taking shaky steps away from his body that just so happened to fall outside of his broad view. Like how one tightens a muscle, he became aware of his entire brain. like it did not belong and had been implanted. The string was now almost indistinguishable as it was united with the whole. A shock coursed through his body, traveling from the head, on the back of his neck, down the spine, and outward through his entire body. It was something that traveled in new veins, not in his blood, but light, surging in a branching pattern within his flesh and bone. Some of the attendants started to stand up in their chairs and looked around in vain for the source of the sound. The entire room started to tremble and shudder, wood creaking from being moved in place. The sound grew in volume, and as a product became more distinguishable, water, rushing, torrenting and flowing water. The doors loudly flew open and the windows crashed open with both a grey daylight and rushing water. The floor was quickly covered. Some of the attendants attempted to flee, while others sat still in their seats as the water slowly surrounded them, seemingly indifferent to their predicament. Those that acknowledged it were violently tossed around in the torrent and hurled within the water out through either a doorway or out by a window. Willem remained where he was in the chair, unfazed by the flowing water, like it was but air, an apparition of the mind, for he felt nothing wet ever touch him. Instead he looked beyond at the great shapes forming within the water outside the window. The water arose to fill the entire room, and he persisted under its surface, but not disturbed by being subsurfaced. Nor did those that had remained in their seats seem to consider themselves in any strange form of danger. They did not even seem completely aware of themselves, with their blank, petrified faces that appeared deformed through the lens of the water. His chair began to move, and he drifted gently along a current that had emerged, out through the window, into the great dark ocean outside, and up towards the surface. Breaking up above, into the air he was surrounded by a great ocean under a grey clouded sky. A calm expanse, a bottomless sea, accepting of all that there is and can be. He tumbled out of the chair and onto his stomach, landing on the surface, not able to break it. As he lay, he felt how the water only suddenly gave way under his weight, but would simply not allow him to pass under conventionally. Yet, he was not in control of himself. He felt displaced, not in contact with his body, for he had no sense of awareness of it. Instead, for the first time, he saw with a great many eyes. He saw not himself, not the body of Master Willem, Provost of Bergenworth, lying face down on the water's surface, but saw a mound, a caterpillar with luminescent flower atop its back. There was no bodily Willem in sight, only his omnipresent sight that beheld this creature. Suddenly he was thrust once more into his body, that lay on its stomach on the Bergenworth grounds, where his old companion Doris came walking towards it.
Ah, seen them, have you? Oh, and look at you. Finally earned something in return.
Doris rolled him over onto his back and dragged him along so he could support him up against the rock.
But you're paid with the entire building. My. Wonder what they'll talk about henceforth in the dream. Master?
He could not move, nor comprehend fully what Doris said, for he was captivated by the grand, white, clouded sky, below which lay a giant body of water instead of the quaint Bergenworth lake. Beyond the stone railing now stretched an endless horizon of water that merged with the cloudy sky, and upon it stood that thing, that glowing lump, completely idle. Doris turned to look behind him after having been given no response, towards the creature on the water.
Oh, I see.
He chuckled behind the gruesome Thumerian mask.
Captivated by that horrible spider. Well, what do you say about the Lunarium, Perhaps you'll get a better glimpse of it again from there.
He picked him up and began to drag him clumsily over to the main building. Around Bergenworth there was nothing. They were both on a little landmass, on an endless body of water under a white clouded sky, where only that thing stood idle in the distance. It all felt just as if a dream had come alive. I, a secret symbol left by Caril, runesmith of Bergenworth. A transcription of I, as spoken by left behind the great ones, allows one to make additional discoveries. Eyes symbolize the truth Master Willem sought in his research. Disillusioned by the limits of human intellect, Master Willem looked to beings from higher planes for guidance, and sought to line his brain with eyes in order to elevate his thoughts.